Hey there, welcome back. Tonight we're taking a quiet journey into something often forgotten, the small, unspoken moments of medieval life. Not the wars or the castles, not the knights or their shining armor, but what came after all that armor came off. Tonight we're talking about cleanliness, specifically what medieval people used instead of toilet paper. So let's slow down, breathe a little, and take a closer look at what life was really like. All you have to do is settle in, get comfortable, and let the story drift over you, like the soft rustle of pages in a dusty old library. Before we start, a small favor. If you enjoy these slow, sleepy journeys through history, consider liking the video or subscribing, only if you really enjoy it. And while you're here, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love imagining this invisible web of listeners, scattered across the world, drifting off to the same tale under different skies. Now, let's begin. Imagine it's a winter evening in the year 1348. A candle flickers inside a small wooden house, its flame trembling every time the wind pushes through the cracks. You can hear the faint hum of someone humming, perhaps a lullaby or a prayer. The air smells faintly of smoke, bread, and something earthy. This is the smell of a home in the Middle Ages. Somewhere in the corner a wooden bucket sits, partly filled with straw and ash. It's not glamorous. It's not even particularly clean. But for a family of 6 living in a one-room cottage, this is the bathroom, the medieval version of one anyway. The idea of toilet paper would have sounded almost absurd back then. Paper itself was precious, expensive, handmade, and reserved for the educated few who could write or draw upon it. No one in their right mind would waste it on something so disposable. So what did they use? Well, it depended on where you lived, what you could afford, and how desperate you were. Nature, as always, provided options. In the northern parts of Europe, people used moss, soft, absorbent, and plentiful in damp forests. It was the quiet savior of many a medieval bottom, especially for peasants who spent their lives close to the land. Moss was gentle, green, and in a strange way even soothing. If you've ever felt its softness under your fingers on a forest walk, you can almost imagine why. In other places, particularly near rivers or coastlines, water itself was the solution. Cold, often freezing water, scooped by hand or poured from a jug. This was less comfortable, perhaps, but surprisingly effective. In fact, this habit survives today in parts of the world where bidets and water cleansing are still preferred. So, in a way, medieval people were ahead of their time. But let's not romanticize it too much. Cleanliness wasn't easy. In a world without plumbing, without soap as we know it, and without the luxury of privacy, staying clean required effort and a certain amount of courage. Picture a medieval castle for a moment. High stone walls, fluttering banners, and torches lighting the grand halls. Now imagine the latrines. They were called garderobes, and they were often built as small protruding chambers off the side of the castle wall, with a narrow stone or wooden bench, and a hole leading directly down into the moat. Yes, into the moat. It sounds clever. In theory, waste goes out, water carries it away, but moats were often stagnant, and castles didn't have running water to flush things clean. So, as you can imagine, the royal residence could sometimes carry a smell that even the strongest perfumes and incense struggled to mask. Still, there was a curious belief back then that hanging clothes in the garderobe might keep away fleas and moths because of the strong, foul odors. That's actually where the modern word wardrobe comes from. So next time you open your closet, be grateful for the centuries of progress and plumbing that separate your neatly folded shirts from their medieval ancestors. Among the wealthy, there were more delicate solutions. Some used fine pieces of cloth, often linen scraps that could be washed and reused. Others used handfuls of straw or hay, sometimes mixed with herbs like thyme or sage, which at least gave the illusion of cleanliness. And the very wealthy, kings, queens, and high clergy, occasionally used wool or even pieces of silk. But don't be too envious. Even silk couldn't save them from the general lack of hygiene that defined much of medieval life. Bathing was rare, plumbing was primitive, and personal cleanliness was a luxury reserved for feast days or illness. For the most part, people simply lived with it. The smells, the discomfort, the little indignities of being human in a world without modern comforts. And yet, somehow they managed. They fell in love, wrote poetry, fought wars, built cathedrals, and raised children. They laughed, they gossiped, they told jokes, even about this very topic. Human nature, it seems, doesn't change much. Let's go deeper into that small cottage again. A mother is teaching her young child how to go properly, not on the floor, not near the hearth, but outside or in the bucket. She doesn't lecture, she demonstrates. The family's life is lived in rhythms, morning chores, evening fires, and quiet moments of necessity. The bucket will be emptied later, often into the street or a pit behind the house. In towns, the waste would eventually be collected by gong farmers, a real occupation, and not a pleasant one. These were the men who cleaned out cesspits and latrines for a living, working mostly at night. They were paid well, but shunned socially, living reminders of what others preferred to forget. When the bucket is emptied, the mother might scatter ashes or straw inside to mask the smell. The ash absorbs moisture and helps keep things tolerable until the next use. Simple but effective, a kind of primitive deodorizer. And in that moment, by firelight, we glimpse something universal. The endless human attempt to make life just a little bit more comfortable. Cleanliness was not only practical, it was spiritual too. The church preached purity of the soul, and though that didn't always translate into soap and water, there was still an awareness, a belief that dirt could be symbolic of sin. Yet ironically, many monks went unwashed for long periods, believing that avoiding comfort kept them humble. There are even records of saints who were proud of not bathing for decades. The smell was seen as proof of devotion. Imagine that. Still, monastic communities often had surprisingly sophisticated facilities, running water channels, communal lavatories, and designated washing times. In some ways, the monks were the cleanest people in Europe. It was the common townsfolk, crowded together in narrow streets, who suffered the most. If you wandered through a medieval town, you'd smell humanity before you saw it. Smoke, bread, manure, sweat, and decay. Animals roamed freely, waste was tossed from windows, people wiped with moss, rags, or whatever they could find. And life went on. Everyday survival dulled the sense of disgust. When you live close to the land, close to animals, close to death itself, you accept the body as it is, imperfect, messy, alive. The medieval person didn't expect comfort, they expected endurance. And so they made do. It's almost poetic in a way. The same hands that built cathedrals also gathered moss in the forest. The same minds that penned illuminated manuscripts found themselves reaching for straw. Human history is full of such contrasts. Beauty and dirt, faith and fear, elegance and necessity, all coexisting quietly in the same small room. Dogs bark distantly. Somewhere, a church bell tolls. Inside, the fire burns low. A mother tucks her children under a rough wool blanket. A bucket stands ready in the corner, silent, waiting. And above it all, the soft hum of life, simple and unashamed. They didn't have toilet paper, but they had rhythm, adaptation, and resilience. They found solutions in the moss, in the rivers, in the ash of their own hearths. And though centuries have passed, something about that quiet resourcefulness still feels familiar. Because comfort, like civilization, is never guaranteed. It's something we build, layer by layer, invention by invention, through 1,000 small acts of survival. If you step outside that medieval cottage, the world smells of wet earth and smoke. The dawn mist still hangs low, wrapping the thatched roofs in a pale grey shawl. Roosters call from somewhere near the edge of the village, and you can hear the slow creak of wooden carts beginning their daily rounds. In this small, cold world, comfort doesn't come from soft pillows or fine linens. It comes from survival, from knowing which patch of moss stays dry under the trees, or which riverbank is cleanest after the rain. Let's talk about those quiet, natural substitutes, the humble heroes of hygiene, the things people used long before toilet paper was ever imagined. Moss was one of nature's kindest gifts. It grew everywhere, on trees, on stones, on the cool, shaded ground of the forest. Soft, green, and slightly springy to the touch, it absorbed moisture like nothing else. For peasants, it was the perfect solution, free, renewable, and found in abundance. People learned to recognize the best kinds, not too dry, not too rough, and never from swampy places. Forest moss, especially sphagnum moss, was ideal. It had natural antibacterial properties, though no one at the time would have understood that. They just knew it worked. During the long winters, villagers would gather it, dry it near the fire, and store it in small woven baskets for later use. You can picture it, a family quietly chatting as they collect moss together, the same way someone today might gather firewood. Centuries later, that same moss would be used in battlefield medicine during World War I, packed into wounds as a sterile dressing. So in a way, those medieval peasants had stumbled onto something science would only rediscover centuries later. Then there was wool, soft when properly cleaned, warm even when damp, and easily cut into small pieces. Of course, only those who had access to sheep could afford to use it for hygiene. For most, wool was precious, spun into clothing or blankets, but scraps and worn pieces could find a second life. It was comfortable, though perhaps a little extravagant for the task. Still, in manor houses or monasteries, you might find evidence of such luxuries. Records from certain estates mention cloths of wool kept in private chambers, used for personal care. The wording is delicate. Medieval scribes avoided directness when it came to bodily matters, but the meaning is clear enough. In cold climates, wool had one obvious advantage: it didn't freeze. Imagine being in a stone castle in January, the wind slipping through every gap. You'd take warmth however you could get it. And a small square of wool might have been worth its weight in comfort. But the most universal solution, the one used from the frozen fjords of Scandinavia to the dry fields of Italy, was water. Plain, cold, and abundant. For many medieval people, cleaning with water was simply part of daily routine, not glamorous, not even particularly pleasant, but practical. In the countryside, it was easy. A small stream or river often served as a communal washing place. People used clay jars or wooden ladles to pour water, and sometimes a handful of moss or grass to aid the process. In cities, it was harder. Water had to be fetched from wells, carried up narrow staircases, or shared at public fountains. Even so, people found ways to stay somewhat clean. The human body, after all, adapts to its environment, and where comfort ends, habit begins. There's something almost admirable about that simplicity. No scented soaps, no fluffy towels, just a basin of cold water and a quiet moment of necessity. You can imagine the shock of it, the sting of cold on bare skin, followed by a sigh, a small shiver, and then relief. That strange universal feeling of freshness, no matter the century. Of course, not everyone had easy access to moss or water. In the Mediterranean, where the landscape was drier, people often turned to stones or pieces of broken pottery, smooth and rounded from use. The ancient Romans had done the same, long before with their famous tersorium, a sponge on a stick, rinsed in vinegar or salt water, and shared communally in public latrines. The medieval mind found that idea both practical and, well, slightly horrifying. Still, traces of the Roman habit survived. In southern Europe, particularly in Italy and Spain, polished stones or bits of pottery continued to serve their purpose. They were cheap, reusable, and available everywhere. Some even wrapped bits of cloth around them to soften the surface. You could say it was the ancestor of modern hygiene products. Crude, yes, but remarkably efficient for its time. In northern Europe, people preferred natural fibers, straw, hay, or even handfuls of dry leaves. Autumn would have provided plenty. There's something almost poetic about that image. The same leaves that fall in golden silence becoming a part of the daily rhythm of life. They were soft enough when dry, though perhaps less so when damp. And like everything else in the medieval world, they were biodegradable, nature returning to nature, in one endless earthy cycle. Farmers, shepherds, and travelers knew these tricks well. A man leading his oxen across the countryside didn't stop to worry about comfort. He used what he found: a handful of grass, a patch of moss, or a smooth stone from the riverbank, whatever was at hand. When necessity calls, invention follows quickly. I would use seashells, the smooth, rounded ones, easy to hold, easy to clean. It sounds strange now, but for those living near the sea, shells were as common as pebbles. There's even a story, perhaps exaggerated, that sailors on long voyages carried small bags of shells for this very purpose. They were durable, washable, and endlessly reusable. The ocean, after all, provided everything else. Why not this too? And then there were the truly creative. In Scandinavia, animal fur or even feathers were occasionally mentioned. In Russia, reeds and small sticks wrapped with cloth. In rural France, linen rags boiled and reused. Each culture, each climate, offered its own improvisations. It's oddly touching how similar the solutions were. Everyone, everywhere, solving the same simple human problem with what nature gave them. If you're imagining this with a slight grimace, that's okay. We've grown used to softness, to scented paper, to the quiet luxury of a clean bathroom. But in the medieval world, the relationship between body and nature was much more direct. People didn't hide from it. They accepted that life was messy, that the body required care just like the hearth or the fields. There was no shame in it, only practicality. And though it may sound primitive, some of these old methods were surprisingly sustainable. No waste, no chemicals, no factories, just moss, water, straw, and patience. In a time when every resource was precious, even the act of cleaning oneself reflected an awareness of the natural world, an unspoken partnership between human and earth. If you stood by a river in the 14th century, you might see a woman kneeling by the bank, washing clothes or rinsing a pot. She might take a moment to splash her hands, or her face, or something more private, not because she thought it made her pure, but because it simply felt right. Clean, cold water biting at her skin, wind tangling her hair, sunlight breaking through the morning mist. It's an image as old as time, the meeting of necessity and nature. And perhaps that's why the medieval person never saw hygiene as separate from daily life. It wasn't a ritual or a luxury, it was just part of being alive. The forest offered moss, the sheep offered wool, the rivers offered water. Everything was connected, and nothing was wasted. Even in the smallest acts, there was a kind of respect for the world that sustained them. When we think of history, we tend to imagine grand events, wars, inventions, kings, but the truth of history often lives in the smallest details. A handful of moss, a scrap of wool, a cold river at dawn. Those quiet, ordinary things tell us more about a civilization than all its monuments, because they remind us that every age, no matter how distant, was made of people just like us, trying to live, to endure, to stay clean, and maybe, just maybe, to feel a little comfortable in their own skin. If you were born into nobility during the Middle Ages, your world smelled different. It wasn't necessarily cleaner, just different. The air in a lord's chamber carried the scent of beeswax, rose oil, and burning tallow candles. Perfume drifted through corridors where fresh air rarely entered. And behind tapestries of hunting scenes and saints, another world waited, quieter, hidden, and less fragrant. Even kings, for all their wealth, had to answer the same call of nature. But unlike peasants crouched in fields or servants emptying buckets into the night, they had the privilege of doing it behind closed doors, or at least behind a curtain. The medieval castle might have been grand, but it wasn't built for comfort. Stone walls trapped cold air, drafts crept under doors, and yet, deep inside these walls, you'd find the garderobe, the nobleman's toilet, a small stone chamber, usually attached to the outer wall, with a narrow bench and a vertical shaft that dropped directly down into open air, or into the moat below. It was private, yes, but not pleasant. The smell lingered, no matter how many herbs were burned nearby. Still, the aristocracy prided themselves on refinement, even in matters of hygiene. Records mention linen cloths perfumed with rosewater, boxes of dried herbs for personal care, and servants dedicated to ensuring their master's comfort in every possible way. One of the most curious inventions of noble life was the close stool. It was essentially a wooden chair with a hole in the middle, lined with a removable bowl or pot beneath. A discreet piece of furniture, often draped with cloth and decorated with carvings, it allowed privacy without leaving the chamber. Servants, usually discreet ones, often eunuchs or trusted attendants, would empty and clean it. It's a humbling thought, really. Even a king, sitting on his velvet-cushioned stool, relied entirely on someone else's hands to carry away his most personal burdens. History books rarely mention them, but those servants were vital, the quiet, invisible workforce behind royal dignity. And for the queen or the lady of the manor, there were burdaloo, delicate chamber pots shaped like shallow ovals, often made of porcelain or pewter. They were designed so that women in long skirts could use them discreetly without removing layers of clothing. You might even find one tucked beneath a bench in a carriage or near a bed. It was elegance meeting necessity, proof that even refinement must bow to biology. Down below, in the villages that surrounded these castles, life was much simpler. The peasants didn't have the luxury of private stools or perfumed cloths. They had ingenuity. In the countryside, people made use of what they had, and they made it work. A handful of straw, a corner of an old rag, the smooth edge of a wooden stick. These were the tools of daily survival, humble yet effective. The medieval peasant's day began before dawn and ended after dusk. Their homes were small, often shared with animals. In winter, a pig or two might even sleep in the same space to share warmth. And when nature called, there was no hesitation. A quick trip to the back of the yard, behind a low stone wall, or sometimes a bucket that was later emptied onto the fields. Human waste, after all, could be useful. Mixed with straw and manure, it became fertilizer, part of the endless cycle of the land. It's an image that's hard for us to imagine now. Necessity, practicality, and acceptance, all living together in one humble act. And then there were the monks, the bridge between noble comfort and peasant simplicity. Monastic communities valued discipline, cleanliness, and order. Their lavatories were communal, long stone benches with evenly spaced holes and water running below to carry waste away. In some monasteries, like those in Cluny or Fountains Abbey, the design was astonishingly advanced. early examples of what we'd now call plumbing. They had channels to divert rainwater, systems for washing, and even warm rooms for bathing. To the monks, hygiene wasn't just physical, it was moral. They believed the body was the vessel of the soul and should be treated with a certain respect. Yet they were also practical and inventive. Strips of cloth, wool, or smooth river stones were common tools of cleaning, kept in baskets near the lavatorium. The rules didn't specify what to use, only that cleanliness be maintained. It's strangely comforting to know that even the most pious among them had to deal with the same humble realities, and did so with quiet efficiency. Royal privilege, peasant ingenuity, monastic discipline, 3 layers of the same society, all united by one need. But while nobles relied on servants, and peasants on the land, there was one group that existed somewhere in between: the travelling merchants, pilgrims and soldiers. Imagine the life of a medieval traveller. Days spent walking dusty roads, sleeping in barns or roadside inns, a leather satchel at their hip, maybe carrying a knife, a pouch of coins, a rosary, and a cloth, not for blowing their nose but for cleaning themselves along the way. Water was scarce, so they improvised: grass, snow, or even smooth sticks carved just for that purpose. Some carried small flasks of vinegar or wine to rinse with, which probably stung, but it worked. The chronicles of travellers like Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo mention strange customs of hygiene they saw across different lands, from China's bamboo paper to the Islamic world's ritual washing with water and the left hand. To a medieval European, these practices must have seemed both foreign and fascinating, and in some quiet way they planted the seeds of change. Noble courts, word of such practices travelled slowly. Imagine a French noblewoman in the 14th century hearing that in faraway lands, people used paper for cleaning. Paper, the same rare, expensive thing used for letters and illuminated manuscripts. It would have sounded decadent, even blasphemous. But curiosity lingers in the human mind, and where curiosity lingers, change eventually follows. Still, for centuries, the status quo held. Peasants kept using the land's gifts. Monks maintained their ordered routines. Nobles perfumed their chambers and left the unpleasant parts to others. Each class adapted, in its own way, to the same inescapable truth. No one, no matter how rich or holy, escapes the needs of the body. There's a strange sort of equality in that, isn't there? A reminder that for all the differences in wealth and birth, humanity remains bound by the same small, humbling realities. Kings and farmers alike stared at the same moon at night, ate bread from the same earth, and answered the same call of nature. If you strip away the titles, the stone walls and the velvet robes, you find the same fragile, ingenious creature underneath, making do, improvising, surviving. That's perhaps one of the most endearing things about the Middle Ages. People didn't have the means we have today, but they had resilience. And where luxury wasn't available, imagination filled the gap. In some castles, you'd even find servants tasked specifically with keeping the garderobes clear, called scourers. Armed with buckets, brushes, and a strong stomach, they worked quietly, usually at night. They were paid well, but avoided in polite company. It was said that even the rats pitied them, yet without them, the castle could not function. And in the villages, the gong farmers, those same men who emptied cesspits and waste barrels, became an essential part of medieval urban life. They often worked by torchlight, waist-deep in filth, scraping the bottom of the pits, hauling it out with ropes. It was dangerous, disgusting work, but vital. Cities like London and Paris depended on them, and many grew surprisingly wealthy from it. It's said that a good gong farmer could make more in a night than a carpenter earned in a week. So while nobles dined above and peasants tilled the soil, these hidden workers, the invisible sanitation class, kept the medieval world from drowning in its own waste. Unbest, and there, it's easy to laugh at their methods now. The moss, the cloth, the straw, but perhaps in their simplicity, there's something we've lost. They lived in rhythm with the earth. They understood the cycles of nature, even the unpleasant ones. And while we wrap ourselves in comfort and fragrance, they found dignity in making do with what they had. It's humbling, and maybe even beautiful in its own small way. The reminder that civilization has always rested on the quiet labor of those who deal with the things others prefer not to see. If there's one thing that surprises most people about the Middle Ages, it's this: medieval Europeans weren't as filthy as we like to imagine, not always at least. Yes, there were dark winters and foul smells, and yes, the streets of London or Paris could become rivers of mud and worse. But in between those grim realities, there was also a quiet culture of bathing, of steam, soap and ritual washing that still flickered across towns and monasteries like candles in the gloom. Before the plague years, before superstition hardened into fear, bathhouses were as common as bakeries. You could find them in every major town, small, steamy buildings where people gathered to wash, gossip and rest. They weren't luxurious by modern standards, but they offered warmth, water, and a momentary escape from the cold and toil of daily life. Imagine stepping inside one on a frosty evening around 1300. The air is heavy with steam, the wooden benches slick with moisture, a few candles flicker on the walls, their light caught in the mist. Men and women sit wrapped in linen sheets, talking softly. A bucket of hot water hisses as it's poured into a tub, and someone laughs in the corner. For a brief moment, the rigid class structure of medieval life melts away. Everyone is simply human again. Bathhouses were both practical and social. They were the closest thing the medieval world had to modern wellness culture. Merchants met there to discuss business, travelers rested their weary feet, and lovers sometimes arranged secret encounters beneath the rising steam. Not everyone approved of that last part, of course. The church often frowned upon public bathing, fearing the moral decay that might accompany physical cleanliness. But the people, ever practical, simply kept going. In German towns like Nuremberg or Cologne, entire families would bathe together, men and women sometimes separated by thin partitions, sometimes not at all. It wasn't considered scandalous at first. It was just life. Cleanliness was health, and health was a gift from God. To wash was to honor the body he had given you. The soaps of the time were simple, made from animal fat, ashes and herbs like lavender or rosemary. They smelled earthy, smoky, faintly sweet. In monasteries, monks often crafted their own, pressing them into round cakes that dried slowly in the cool air. To bathe in such water was a rare pleasure, a kind of meditation. Steam rising, candlelight flickering, muscles relaxing after days of labor. For a brief moment, the world outside could wait. Of course, not everyone could afford the luxury of a bathhouse. In villages, people bathed less frequently, maybe a few times a year, often tied to religious festivals or seasonal milestones. When they did, it was usually in a wooden barrel or tub, with water heated over the fire. The whole family might share the same water, starting with the father, then the mother, and finally the children, in order of importance and cleanliness. There's an old saying from later centuries, "Don't throw the baby out with the bath water." It probably came from this very custom. By the time the youngest child was washed, the water was so murky you could hardly see what was in it. But even in such modest routines there was joy. Children laughed, mothers scolded, and fathers sighed contentedly as warmth crept into their bones. These were rare moments of comfort, the small oases in a world that asked much and gave little. Still, not everyone viewed bathing kindly. As the centuries passed, the church's stance on physical cleanliness began to shift. The idea of humility, of denying the flesh, took precedence over comfort. Some clerics began preaching that bathing could lead to vanity or sin, especially if done too often. Cleanliness, they argued, was a temptation, a form of indulgence. A clean body did not guarantee a clean soul. And so, gradually, many public bathhouses fell out of favor. After the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, fear joined faith in driving people away from the water. It was believed that heat and steam opened the pores, allowing disease to slip in. Better, they thought, to stay sealed, to wear your dirt like armor. In a strange twist of irony, the same church that had once built aqueducts and fountains now viewed water with suspicion. Washing became private, infrequent and symbolic. People began to cleanse themselves not with soap, but with prayer. Lapped to religion and hygiene never fully parted ways. In monasteries, water was sacred. The lavatorium or washing room was often placed near the refectory, the dining hall, so that monks could cleanse their hands before meals. Running water diverted from nearby streams flowed through carved stone troughs. The sound of it must have been soothing, a quiet rhythm in the daily chant of monastic life. In Islamic Spain, meanwhile, the influence of Muslim culture left its mark. Mosques had hammams, elaborate bathhouses for ritual purification. Cleanliness was not just physical, but spiritual, woven into daily life. When Christian knights returned from the Crusades, many brought back admiration for these customs, though they rarely admitted it. In some parts of Europe, especially Italy, these habits mingled. Florentine merchants built private baths in their homes, fed by cisterns or small aqueducts. Water became once again a symbol of refinement and wealth, not sin. And then there were the buckets. Buckets, barrels, and basins, the unsung heroes of medieval hygiene. Every household had them, every servant hauled them. They carried not just water for washing, but for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. In an age before running taps, every drop mattered. At dawn, the sound of wooden pails clattering against stone was the heartbeat of daily life. A servant or child might trudge to the well, fill the bucket, balance it carefully on a yoke, and carry it back, spilling a little with each step. Water was heavy, life was heavy, but it was also precious. When you think of hygiene in the Middle Ages, picture not just dirt and disease, but those buckets. Picture the hands that filled them, the backs that bent to lift them, the quiet sigh of relief when the job was done. Every act of cleanliness began there, with effort, with patience, with a deep respect for the simple miracle of clean water. But there's another kind of bucket, one less noble, yet just as essential, the chamber pot. It sat under beds, in corners, or behind curtains, sometimes plain, sometimes ornate. In castles, it was made of brass or pewter, in cottages of clay. Emptying it was a chore, and like most unpleasant chores, it often fell to servants or children. At night, when the cold was sharp and wolves howled in the distance, no one wanted to step outside. The pot became a quiet companion, practical, if unglamorous. In the morning, its contents would be thrown into the street or garden, sometimes with a shouted warning, "Garde à l'eau! Watch out for the water!" Those passing below learned quickly to walk close to the walls, not under the windows, robadest loc remogit. So between the bathhouses, buckets and beds, medieval hygiene was a balance of ingenuity and endurance. People did what they could when they could, with what they had. Cleanliness wasn't a constant, it was an event. And yet, even in hardship there was pride. A well-kept home, no matter how small, reflected virtue. A person who washed their hands before eating was civilized. A woman who perfumed her linens with lavender showed care and grace. And a monk who purified himself before prayer honored both body and soul. Cleanliness, for all its challenges, became a quiet expression of hope, a belief that even in a world of mud and misery, beauty could still exist. There's something endearing about that, isn't there? The way people found dignity in small rituals, in washing their hands before bread, in heating a little water for a bath, in hanging herbs near the window to scent the air. It reminds us that hygiene, at its core, isn't just about avoiding dirt, it's about feeling human. Even now, when we turn a tap or light a candle by the bath, we're echoing the same gestures, chasing the same warmth, the same calm that medieval hands once did centuries ago. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine the textures of a medieval world. Not the grand surfaces of marble or silk, but the everyday ones. The rough grain of unfinished wood beneath your hand, the coarse weave of wool against your skin, the chill of damp stone under bare feet in the morning. Life back then wasn't smooth or polished. It was textured, tactile, alive with sensation. Every action, eating, working, washing, had a physicality to it. Even hygiene, especially hygiene. Today, we're surrounded by softness, cotton towels, scented soaps, temperature-controlled water. But for medieval people, cleanliness was something felt, not expected. A brief, sensory moment between labor and exhaustion. And if you pay attention, you can almost feel what they felt. Let's begin with cloth. Linen, the most common fabric, was everywhere. In shirts, shifts, tablecloths, and yes, for cleaning. It came from flax, harvested and beaten and spun by hand. A good piece of linen was prized, cared for, patched and reused until it finally tore into scraps. Those scraps, soft from age and use, became the medieval equivalent of paper towels for wiping spills, washing faces, or tending to other, more private matters. The coarser linen was scratchy at first, but it softened with every wash, every rub between the hands. You can picture someone in a small cottage, sitting by the fire, tearing an old sheet into squares and folding them neatly. A small act of practicality, almost domestic tenderness. Cleanliness began not in grand gestures, but in these quiet preparations. Well, we are par. Then there was wool, that rough, fibrous miracle that clothed nearly all of Europe. It could be thick or thin, itchy or smooth, depending on the sheep and the season. Freshly spun wool smelled faintly of lanolin and smoke, a scent both comforting and persistent. And when it came to hygiene, worn-out wool garments were often cut into smaller pieces, repurposed for wiping or washing. It wasn't soft, not like linen, but it was absorbent and durable. and in the endless chill of a drafty house or castle, it had another advantage: warmth. Imagine being a shepherd in January, crouched near a fire after a long day in the cold. The air bites, the smoke stings your eyes, and you reach for whatever scrap of fabric is nearest. Luxury, in that moment, is anything that keeps you warm and dry. For peasants, comfort came not from materials but from familiarity. Rough cloth, stiff straw, even moss, all were known to the hand. They didn't recoil from them. They were part of life, part of the earth itself. Moss, as soft as memory, was a gentle constant. It held moisture but never dripped, and it smelled faintly of rain. Gathered from forest stones or the shaded sides of trees, it was one of nature's quiet miracles. Even centuries later, soldiers in the First World War would rediscover its use for wounds, just as their ancestors had used it for cleanliness. That continuity, the same texture passing through the hands of different generations, is almost poetic. It reminds us that comfort is not always invention. Sometimes it's rediscovery. Then there were the tools, the buckets, basins, cloths, and brushes of daily life. A basin of water was often a household centerpiece. You can imagine it, a wide metal bowl, slightly dented, shining faintly in the firelight. Every evening, someone would pour a fresh bucket of water into it, sometimes mixed with herbs or a dash of vinegar. That water was for everything: washing faces, hands, sometimes even feet. And in those small nightly rituals, there was dignity. The brush, if you could call it that, might be a bundle of twigs or reeds tied with twine. It wasn't gentle, but it got the job done. A servant might use one to scrub a floor, or a mother might use a softer version to wash her child's hair. There were no synthetic fibers, no colourful plastic, just what nature provided, shaped by hand, used with care. The body itself was treated as something sturdy, not fragile. Medieval people were used to cold, to calluses, to roughness. They washed with coarse cloths, not sponges. Their soap, if they had any, was hard and grainy, made from lye and animal fat. It scraped away dirt but left behind a faint smell of smoke. Not unpleasant, just real. Even water felt different. It wasn't warm unless you heated it by hand. To wash in winter meant bracing yourself, teeth clenched, breath sharp. The shock of cold water on skin was almost spiritual. It woke you up, humbled you, reminded you that life itself was a kind of endurance. And yet, when you read old diaries and chronicles, you find surprisingly little complaint about it. They didn't expect comfort, they expected necessity, and from that expectation came resilience. But textures weren't just physical, they were emotional too. Cleanliness carried meaning. To a monk, washing was a form of prayer, a cleansing of both body and soul. To a mother, it was love, wiping a child's hands before supper, brushing dirt from their cheeks. To a noblewoman, it was refinement, a ritual that separated her from the labourers who worked her land. And to a farmer, it was survival, keeping sickness away when medicine was still a mystery. The feel of clean skin after days of work, the comfort of warm water after a frost. These small sensations carried more weight than we can imagine. When the world was hard, even the simplest relief felt divine. Smell, too, was part of the texture of life. Medieval Europe smelled of people and animals, of bread and smoke, of manure and herbs. There were no artificial perfumes, only nature in all its blunt honesty. But people still tried to tame it. Bundles of lavender, sage, and rosemary hung near doors. Roses and marjoram floated in bowls of water to sweeten the air. In noble homes, servants burned incense or sprinkled rosewater on floors. And for the poorest, a few crushed mint leaves in a pot of water was enough. They didn't have deodorants or sprays, but they had ingenuity, and perhaps a deeper tolerance for the way life actually smelled. It wasn't about perfection, it was about harmony, balancing the human with the natural, the fragrant with the foul. Louder Bidventilio Titel Fistrich, there's a strange comfort in imagining all of this. A world where the roughness of wool, the chill of stone, the scent of wood smoke was simply normal, where comfort came not from luxury, but from familiarity, and where cleanliness wasn't sterile, it was honest. We live now in a world of smooth surfaces and filtered air, where every scent is engineered, every fabric processed. But the medieval person's world was alive in every sense. When they washed, they felt the grain of the basin beneath their hands. When they wiped their face, they felt the roughness of cloth. Every act reminded them that they were part of the earth, not separate from it. Leitbrevjob's feel of necessity, then, was both humbling and grounding. It made life slower, more deliberate. You didn't take water for granted. You hauled it. You didn't waste cloth, you mended it. You didn't chase luxury, you found comfort in the ordinary. And maybe that's why their world, for all its hardships, still holds a quiet appeal. It was raw, but it was real. It had texture, the kind you can almost feel beneath your fingertips, even centuries later. They say scent is the strongest trigger of memory, and perhaps, if we could somehow walk through a medieval street, the first thing we'd remember would be the smell. Not a single scent, but a tapestry of them. Wood smoke curling from chimneys, the sour tang of ale and sweat, the faint sweetness of hay, and somewhere beneath it all, the steady pulse of life and decay intertwined. To live in the Middle Ages was to breathe in the world in all its honesty. But what did that mean for cleanliness and for the people themselves? It meant that smell wasn't just background, it was meaning. It told you who someone was, what they did, and how high they stood in the fragile hierarchy of life. In the countryside, the air smelled of earth and animals, of sweat and open fields. For the peasant, these were the scents of survival, not shame. To smell of soil was to show that you worked, that your hands had earned your bread. A faint musk of livestock meant you had food for winter. There was dignity in it, a rough, honest dignity. In towns, however, the story changed. As people crowded together inside walls, smells began to layer upon each other until they became something else entirely. The butcher's stall, the tanner's vat, the horse droppings, the gutters, the refuse tossed from windows. Even the wind seemed tired of carrying it all. To modern ears, that might sound unbearable, but medieval people had a different relationship with odor. They didn't recoil as we do. They read it. Smell was communication. A perfumed person was rich. A smoky one was poor. A foul odor could mean illness or sin. Saints were said to emit pleasant fragrances when they died, while sinners left behind stench. Even the idea of holy cleanliness wasn't about soap and water. It was about spiritual purity, the sweet odor of grace. It's an oddly poetic belief, isn't it? That goodness could smell like flowers and evil like decay. But this belief seeped deep into daily life, shaping how people saw themselves and each other. A peasant might not wash often, but he didn't see himself as unclean. He was part of the soil, part of creation. A monk, meanwhile, might deliberately avoid bathing, believing that suffering the stench of the body brought him closer to God. He wore his odor like a badge of humility. Still, not everyone shared that ascetic view. By the late Middle Ages, the upper classes began to rediscover the power of scent, not as hygiene, but as presentation. Perfumes, scented waters, and pomanders became status symbols. Imagine a noblewoman preparing for a feast. A servant brushes her hair by candlelight. She dips a cloth into rose water and dabs her wrists and neck. At her waist hangs a small ball, a pomander, made of silver and filled with herbs, cloves, and ambergris. As she moves, it releases a gentle fragrance that masks the realities of the hall, the smoke, the sweat, the roast meat cooling on the table. Scent was not merely decoration, it was defense, against disease, against shame, against being perceived as less. If cleanliness was difficult, smelling pleasant became a substitute for it, a way to signal refinement in a world where true hygiene was hard to achieve. Ardovation, even the objects of daily life began to carry this awareness. Clothes were sprinkled with lavender water, gloves were rubbed with scented oils, letters were pressed with petals before sealing. A faint perfume became the hallmark of civilization, a fragile shield of beauty against the unrelenting earthiness of existence. But there was always tension beneath it. For every person who sought sweetness, there was another who mistrusted it. Scent could disguise corruption just as easily as it could signal purity. A man who smelled too strongly of musk might be hiding indulgence. A woman who perfumed herself could be accused of vanity, or worse, it was a fine line between refinement and sin. And Arum dus Spaniern. In cities, this tension played out in the streets. Municipal records from medieval London and Paris show an almost desperate battle against smell. Regulations were passed ordering butchers to move their stalls outside the city walls. Tanners and dyers were confined to riverbanks, where the breeze could carry their odours away. Citizens were fined for dumping waste into the street, though most continued to do so anyway. Every spring there were efforts to clean, cesspits emptied, drains flushed, straw scattered on muddy streets to absorb filth. And yet by autumn, the same smells returned, as constant as the church bells. The city breathed, decayed, and was reborn, season after season. For medieval people, cleanliness was not an ideal to be achieved once and for all. It was a rhythm, a cycle, like the turning of the year. And within that rhythm grew the quiet sense of shame, not moral shame but social. The awareness that how you smelled defined your place in the world. A noble who reeked of sweat would be whispered about. A peasant who appeared too fragrant might be mocked for pretending to be what he was not. This fragile balance between scent and status created its own etiquette. The church might have preached humility, but society demanded appearances, and so people powdered their hair, burned herbs, perfumed their bedsheets. Even a few drops of scented oil in a basin of water could make a person feel reborn. Perhaps that was the true miracle, not the fragrance itself but the sense of renewal it offered. To smell clean was to believe for a moment that the world could be softened. There's a curious tenderness in the way smell shaped medieval emotions. Parents hung sachets of herbs near cradles to protect their babies from bad air. Lovers exchanged small perfumed gifts, believing scent could preserve affection across distance. Even in death, people tried to tame decay, washing bodies with wine or vinegar, wrapping them in herbs before burial. It was an act of mercy, an attempt to hold on to beauty just a little longer. And so, even the smell of civilization, the mix of sweat and soap, of rot and roses, became part of what it meant to be human. To live was to breathe, to endure, to smell the truth of life, and try, however gently, to make it better. If you walk through a museum today and see a medieval tapestry, you can almost imagine its scent, not just dust and time, but faint echoes of wool, smoke and lavender, a whole vanished world woven into fabric. Every fibre holds a trace of its maker's hands, their world, their sweat, their care, cleanliness and dirt, beauty and odour, inseparable, intertwined. That was the paradox of the Middle Ages, the belief that civilization could be measured not by how clean you were, but by how you carried your imperfections. The smells were real, but so were the attempts to rise above them, to bring a little grace to the grime. So when we look back now, it's easy to laugh at the lack of soap, the buckets, the moss, but beneath that laughter lies something tender, a recognition that they too wanted to feel clean, to smell of something better than hardship. And in their struggle to balance earth and purity, they left behind a truth that lingers still, that civilization isn't the absence of dirt, but the decision to keep trying to wash it away. It's strange to think that something as ordinary as toilet paper, that soft white roll hanging quietly beside us, has a history written in centuries of moss, water, and improvisation. The story of cleanliness didn't unfold overnight. It drifted slowly through time, carried by trade, by invention, and by the endlessly inventive human desire to make life just a little more comfortable. The medieval world, with all its roughness and rhythm, was never static. Even as people used moss or wool or handfuls of straw, whispers of other ways began to travel, across deserts, across oceans, across the known world, and those whispers would in time change everything. The first known use of paper for hygiene comes from far away, not from Europe at all, but from China. As early as the 6th century, scholars there wrote of paper for the restroom, made from mulberry bark and hemp fibre, soft enough for the task. By the 14th century, Chinese records show massive production, thousands of sheets crafted for the imperial family alone. The emperor, even in his most private moments, was surrounded by silk and perfumed paper. Civilization in its quietest act, but the idea would take a very long time to reach the West. In medieval Europe, paper was still sacred, for letters, books, scripture. To use it for anything else would have been unthinkable, even scandalous. So the peasants kept their moss, the nobles their cloth, and the monks their stones. Practicality ruled the day. As centuries passed, though, the world began to change. Trade routes opened. Paper became cheaper, spreading through merchants' hands like a whisper of the future. Cities grew larger, filthier, hungrier for solutions. And slowly, very slowly, people began to imagine cleanliness not as a privilege, but as a necessity. In the 17th and 18th centuries, chamber pots gave way to early toilets, crude, wooden devices with seats and hidden containers. By the 19th century, with the rise of modern plumbing, the private act of cleaning oneself became a new symbol of civility. Cleanliness moved indoors, away from the shared spaces of bathhouses and courtyards, into the intimate quiet of private rooms. The old rhythms of water carried in buckets were replaced by the soft hiss of pipes. The rough hands of gong farmers gave way to invisible systems underground. And for the first time in history, the simple act of washing could be done in silence, in solitude. There's something both comforting and melancholy in that shift. The medieval person's world was communal, even in its messiness. You washed your hands at a shared basin. You bathed with others at the public house. You relieved yourself near walls others built, emptied by hands you'd never meet. It wasn't private, but it was human. Now, cleanliness is solitude. We've built layers of privacy, layers of softness, and yet, in that softness, we've lost some of the intimacy with the world that once defined us. No more moss gathered from the forest, no more buckets sloshing in the cold dawn, no more shared warmth of the bathhouse, laughter rising in the steam. We've built comfort, yes, but we've also built distance. When the first commercial toilet paper appeared in the 1800s sold in sheets, not rolls, it was marketed as a luxury. Soft, sanitary, convenient. It was a triumph of industry and marketing, but also of imagination. For the first time, the act of cleanliness was framed not as survival, but as self-care. By the time the 20th century arrived, that idea had become universal. Plumbing and paper spread across continents. The hum of water through pipes replaced the sound of wells and buckets. And the old ways, moss, straw, ash, river, faded into the long silence of forgotten habits. It's easy to take it all for granted now, but if you trace it back, every soft sheet of paper, every clean sink, every quiet restroom owes its existence to the long, patient centuries of people who had none of it, who made do, who endured, who cleaned themselves with courage and moss, and a kind of grace. Sometimes, late at night, when everything is still, it's worth remembering that our modern comforts are built upon those small acts of endurance. Every medieval hand that scooped cold water from a basin, every servant who hauled a bucket, every monk who washed before prayer, all of them were part of the same human story, the search for comfort in a difficult world. And perhaps that's what civilization really is, not marble cathedrals or golden crowns, but the quiet effort to make life a little cleaner, a little kinder, a little softer. It's the warmth of water after a day's work. It's the satisfaction of feeling human again. It's the dignity of caring for the body as much as the soul. So the next time you reach for something soft and ordinary, take a small breath and remember the journey that led there, from moss to silk, from stone to paper, from rivers to running taps, the long, winding story of humanity's most private ritual. Because history isn't just written in ink and blood. Sometimes it's written in water, in ash, in silence. And maybe that's the most human part of all. The way we've always sought to turn the roughness of life into something gentle, something that reminds us that we're not just surviving, we're living. If you've drifted this far with me, maybe you're already half asleep, and that's perfectly fine. Let the world of moss and candlelight fade into dreams. Let the cold stone walls of medieval cottages soften into the quiet hum of the present. Because somewhere between their world and ours, the same wish lingers, to feel clean, to feel safe, to feel at peace. If you enjoyed drifting through this piece of the past, maybe leave a like, or just let the story carry you to sleep. Good night, traveler of time, and may your dreams be clean, soft, and kind.